Hey everyone! Last week of lecture, you're almost to the end. We are starting this week off with chapter 15, Enhancing Family Functioning and Relationships. This little spiel might be slightly longer than the others because I just think that it's so important that when we're working with individuals, we also find ways to connect with the family. And there are a lot of different ways that we can do this. And so the big idea here that I really want to reinforce from chapter 15 is that when social workers work with families, the client is often the pattern of interaction, not necessarily an individual family member who appears to have the problem. Okay. So I think it's really, really common for us to think, well, who is causing the problem in this situation, in this family unit, and how do we change that person? When really, family practice requires us to think a bit differently. For example, what happens between family members that may be maintaining the problem? Okay, I'm going to give you an example. So bear with me, and I'll give a few examples as we go today. So imagine a parent brings in, or parents bring in, a 15-year-old because he's disrespectful and completely out of control. So it would be easy, really easy for us to focus exclusively on the teenager's behavior. But in a family-oriented setting or in a family-oriented assessment, we're asking much broader questions. We're not just going to focus on the teenager. So what happens immediately before the teenager becomes disrespectful? How do the parents respond? Then what happens next? Does anybody withdraw? Does someone escalate? Is there another family member, maybe another sibling who intervenes in the situation? So, and then how does the conflict eventually end, right? So we're looking for a more interactional cycle rather than simply identifying who is the problem person here. So, a couple key things I want to talk about from the chapter. Number one, communication patterns. So, one of the first areas to assess is how family members communicate with one another. So, things that we can watch for. Who talks and who remains silent? So when you're sitting there with the entire family in the room, who talks and who remains silent? Also, where is everyone sitting? Right? So even where they're seated can tell us a lot of information. Who interrupts? Who answers questions for other family members? Can family members express disagreement in safety? Do they communicate directly or maybe like through another person within the family? Do they listen to understand or primarily listen to respond? Are feelings expressed openly? Are messages clear, or does the family expect others to just know what someone needs? Okay, so a lot we can pay attention to in terms of communication in that family session. So when we can observe communication patterns right in the session, that's going to be really, really helpful. Here's another example. So maybe the parent says, "Tell her why you didn't go to school," and the teen says, "Well, I can answer for myself." And the parent says, "Well, apparently you can't because you still haven't even told the truth yet." So, pausing, rather than immediately determining who is right in the situation, this is an opportunity for the social worker to recognize that an interactional pattern is occurring right in front of us. And so we might say, "I noticed that when I asked Jordan, let's just name the kid Jordan, the teenager Jordan, the question, Mom stepped in pretty quickly. Jordan, you seem really frustrated by that. Is that something that happens a lot at home?" So now the interaction itself becomes conversation or material for the actual intervention. It's giving us a speaking point rather than he said, she said, going back and forth with I'm right, I'm right. We're not going to get anywhere. So we're using that interaction as a great example because we're going to pull the intervention from that. Next, conflict is not necessarily the problem. And this is a good distinction, I think, to know because healthy families are not necessarily families that never experience conflict. Disagreement is normal. We know this from our own crazy families, right? We all disagree. Think of your own relationships, right? It's okay, it's normal to disagree, to fight, to argue. But the question is, how does the family manage the disagreement? So some families escalate. One person's anger leads to another person's anger, and that leads to yelling and blaming and threats or aggression. Somebody storms out. Some families completely avoid, and difficult topics are not discussed at all. They're swept under the rug, and we don't ever talk about them. And then there are still other families who have patterns where one person pursues while another withdraws, right? One person's like, well, we need to talk about it. And then the other person's like, I'm not talking about it. And then the person says, well, you never talk about anything. And then the person says, well, because every time we talk, you yell at me or you over explain. And the cycle just continues. So the social worker's job isn't necessarily to determine who started it, but to help the family recognize the cycle and the patterns and to develop healthier alternatives for communication. Next, boundaries. So boundaries help define who is responsible for what, and it helps and to how much access family members have to one another's emotional and personal lives. Okay, so boundaries can be problematic at either extreme. For example, very rigid boundaries in a family might look like some family members functioning almost completely independently. There might be limited emotional expression, children feeling like they cannot approach their parents with a problem. And then there's overly diffuse boundaries. So the other end of the spectrum might involve limited privacy or excessive involvement in one another's decisions, or a child becoming involved in the adult's problems that are not really developmentally appropriate for the child to know. So an example might be a mother repeatedly discussing marital problems with their 13-year-old daughter and relying on the child for emotional support. So the social worker doesn't need to label the mother as bad, but instead we might explore whether the child has been placed in a role that's inappropriate or burdensome given their age, and then helping the family to establish healthier boundaries. Who else can mom talk to about these issues, and to remove that responsibility or burden off of the child. Next, family roles. So families naturally develop roles. Think of your own families. So someone might be the caretaker. You can even think of your friend groups here. The responsible one, the peacemaker, the problem child, the successful child, the family spokesperson, the one who speaks up on behalf of the family, or the protector. So roles are not automatically unhealthy, but the concern is when they become very rigid or prevent the families from developing their own needs or having their own needs recognized. So for example, imagine that there's a 16-year-old who is consistently responsible for getting the younger siblings ready for school, cooking dinner, helping with homework, and kind of comforting a parent who is very overwhelmed. So they take on that parenting role. Rather than simply praising that teenager for being mature, the social worker should ask, is this young person carrying responsibilities that belong to an adult? And this moves from simply observing the behavior to assessing family functioning and putting things into a different perspective or different lens for the adults in the room. Reframing is another one. So reframing, and this is a really, really practical skill, y'all. Reframing means helping family members look at behavior or interaction from just a different and often less blaming perspective. So example, my mother is so controlling. She has to know where I am every second. So instead of agreeing that, yeah, mom is very controlling or defending the mother's behavior, we might explore or reframe. It sounds like mom is checking in on you a lot and that feels controlling to you. But I'm also wondering whether some of that behavior might be connected to worry or wanting to keep you safe. So it doesn't mean that the behavior is automatically appropriate, and it's not excusing the harmful behavior, but we're trying to move the family away from you're controlling, you're the problem, toward you become anxious about my safety, and when you're anxious, you check on me a lot, and that comes off as being really controlling, right? So that gives us something we can work with. Another example. So instead of dad doesn't care about this family, consider, well, dad tends to withdraw when conflict gets intense. Now we can explore why the withdrawal is happening and what an alternative response might be for dad to help stay engaged in whatever the family is dealing with. This is a big one. It is hard. Avoid taking sides and creating coalitions. When working with multiple family members, each person in the room is naturally going to want the social worker to understand their perspective, right? And sometimes they will also want the worker to validate that they're right and someone else in the room is wrong. So a parent might say, "You see what I'm dealing with. Tell him it's disrespectful." Or a teenager might say, exactly, that's what I've been telling her. You tell her. And that puts a social worker in a really sticky, difficult situation. So make sure that when you're working with families, you recognize that we can validate someone's experience without picking a side or joining a person's side against another family member. So instead of, you're right, your mother's not giving you enough independence, maybe we can say, I understand why you're frustrated. I also want to hear why mom is so worried, or maybe how she feels about giving you more independence. So the worker in that scenario is maintaining the connection with both people. So the big thing here is don't become one family member's attorney against another family member. We're not picking sides. Next is problem solving. So once the family understands some of the patterns that are happening, interventions become more concrete, right? So the worker can help the family identify the problem, clarify everyone's perspectives. How does everyone feel about it, or what is everyone's thought on the matter? Brainstorm solutions, agree on a plan, try it, and evaluate what worked, right? The normal helping process. So we shouldn't become the family's permanent problem solver. It would be really easy for us to tell them what to do every week, and they may become dependent on us. And so the ultimate goal here is to strengthen the family's ability to solve problems on their own and, do it without the social worker. We don't want to focus only on what's going wrong. And so this brings back the strengths perspective component that we have been talking about in this class. So we want to ask questions like, well, when does this problem not happen? Or tell me about a time your family handled something like this successfully. What worked? What's working well between the two of you? What do you appreciate about each other? What has helped your family get through difficult situations before, right? So sometimes strengthening those existing positive interactions and existing strengths is way more productive than spending time talking about the negative ones. So for example, if parents are constantly reporting conflict with their teenager, but they also mention everyone gets along when they cook on Sunday evenings, right? That's important. That's something we need to remember, because then we can ask, well, what's different about Sunday evenings, right? There might be other clues to healthier family functioning that are embedded in what this family is already doing successfully. And we can use whatever's happening on Sunday, we can pull that into other times of the week when there's conflict. Okay, so to wrap it up, one thing to remember, really, really important, in family practice, don't just ask, what is wrong with this person? Ask, what is the pattern of behavior that keeps happening between these people? Because when patterns change, individual behaviors often change with it.